Welcome to the business podcast of the American Chamber of Commerce in Australia. AmCham business podcasts are hosted by Dr. Duff Watkins. Duff is a director of ExecSearch International, an author, and is also on the AmCham Council of Governors. AmCham, bringing business to you.
Hello and welcome to the AmCham Business Podcast. Today we are addressing the right ways to do business in Australia. My name is Robert Hossery and I'll be your host for this podcast. My guest today is Dr. Duff Watkins. Duff was originally hailing from the USA. He's arrived in Australia 35 years ago. Duff has a PhD in psychotherapy and has worked in executive search for decades. Duff is also the managing director of ExecSearch International. Duff, let me just start off by asking you one very simple question to get the ball rolling. What do our audience need to know about doing business in Australia from a cultural perspective?
Well, Rob, most people think doing business in Australia should be easy. I mean, after all, they speak English, right? And they do. But you've lived in the U.S. For a while and worked there as an Australian. I've lived in Australia for most of my life now from the U.S. and I can tell you that Australians see the world very, very differently than other people do, say Americans. Australia and the U.S. share many economic and political and cultural antecedents, but I'm telling you, they're two different places. So I have thought about this and workshop this. There are 11 things to remember if you want to do business successfully in Australia. 11. And
you're right, yes, I have lived in the US, and you are absolutely right. While we do speak English, it's a different language. We both speak a different language. But tell me about these 11. What would you...
Okay, well, you tell me. Okay, I mean, I think Australians are worldly. Australians travel the world. They travel abroad young, early, and often. The Australians that I know have a great interest and knowledge of U.S. politics or sports or commerce. So consequently, Australians probably know far more about you than you know about them if you're a foreigner seeking to do business in Australia. So in business, Australian knowledge is their edge and your ignorance is your disadvantage. So that's one.
And that's true. I've experienced that firsthand. So I totally agree with you there. I have no comments to
Here's
that.
one that a lot of Americans wouldn't understand. We ride up front. And what I mean by that is, by custom, the Australian Prime Minister rides in the front seat with the driver. He prefers to be addressed by his first name. Now, the U.S. President, he's always in the back of the big black town car. He's always going to be addressed as Mr. President. But in business in Australia, the title on your business card impresses nobody unless you back it up with expertise.
Look, I again totally agree with you, but may I ask you a question about that point? Is that a good thing or a bad thing in your opinion?
Well, I think so. And you see it again in business. This takes us to the next point. In Australia, management builds bridges, not towers, and that's because leadership is fraternal in Australia. In other words, a business leader, a new manager will come in, and you got to build a bridge to the staff, to your colleagues. You got to help them see a future so they can feel secure about doing what's necessary to arrive there. Now, you contrast that with the U.S. style of authoritative, take charge leadership. Now, that just plain grates on Australians. And Australian leaders win respect of peers and colleagues by virtue of the character and competence rather than just the title or the position. So bottom line is issuing orders from afar, whatever foreign headquarters it may be, simply won't accomplish much here.
True. Would you say that it's a better management style? The Australians have a better management style because of that collaborative approach?
Yeah, yes, and the proof is that most people don't know this. Here's a secret. Australia exports management talent. For example, Ford at one time had 70 Australians working out of Australian international roles. And one of the reasons is because they're so flexible and adaptable. Now here's a point for you. Within 20 minutes, I can meet a U.S. executive. usually U.S., and I can see whether they're a tourist or a transplant. That's all it takes. And a tourist is someone who they're just spending time here, they're getting their ticket punched for their next corporate role, they're not really engaged, whereas a transplant, someone who is fully engaged with the local Australian culture, and I don't mean you don't have to go native to succeed in Australia, but honestly, who wants to work for a tourist? Far better to be a transplant, take an active interest in your new surroundings, especially if you want to be listened to by your peers, your customers, your staff. And the same is true for politicians, by the way, as I'm sure you've noticed.
In what sense? What do you mean by that?
Well, some politicians are more engaged than others, and some are just sort of spending time here and mailing it in. But
and managers who are not engaged, just biding their time, just treading water till their tour of duty is up until they go back.
That's right, and they're not taken seriously by their staff.
And by that inference, I'm hearing, and I've experienced it, but I'm hearing in what you say that staff picks up on this.
Oh, yeah.
And as soon as staff pick up on this, their productivity levels are adjusted accordingly.
Well, they stop listening. They tune you out. I mean, why wouldn't they? Wouldn't you? That's what happens. It happens around the world, of course. But
this is true. Well, you know, in the US when I was there, I was the head honcho. Therefore, they listened to me. And I must admit, Duff, what you're saying is absolutely correct, because I found that they found my laid backness, if that's a word, my irreverence to authority, a little off-putting.
Yeah.
From the way they were, but you know, in those cases, they still appreciated the talent, and this is going back to the first point you made. I backed it up with talent. You know, the one issue I had over in the US was understanding some of their some of the labor laws that they had there. I worked in Texas, which was an at-will state, which meant if I didn't like you, I could fire you. How do you think that someone from a state like that, you know, following those kind of labor laws, deals with the kind of labor laws we have here in Australia?
Yeah, that's my advice to anybody, but particularly Americans coming to Australia. Learn to love our labor laws. And you experienced it, Rob. You experienced it in reverse. Now, U.S. employers come to Australia, they find the labor laws to be odd and generous. I mean, our privacy rules restrict what we can ask candidates. And so the employees, to the employer's eyes, receive a bewildering array of entitlements, and also the laws differ from state to state.
Oh, yeah.
So what works in the U.S. simply doesn't work here. So you have to seek professional advice in this area. Now, on that, you can contact me, you can contact Rob at the American Chamber of Commerce. There is a repository of knowledge able to help you, listeners. And you want to do this because, as one lawyer told me, and I quote, employment law is one area of business where if you're operating in Australia without good legal advice, you're just walking around with a big kick me sign on your back. So you've got to learn to embrace the local labor laws and remember that every problem you face or may face has already been solved successfully by someone who's operating in Australia, and it could be your competitor.
Well, you're a professional in this area, Duff. You have had first-hand experience helping your clients with these kind of issues. How big of an issue is this for, you know, transplanted executive managers?
Well, you either get it very quickly or you don't, and since it is part of the culture here, you know, really the transplants have no difficulty.
So you're saying to me it's a skill set that either they will understand and learn, or
it's a mindset. Yeah, mindset.
Okay, that
is just different here.
Is that a from a business point of view? Do you see that as a risk to the business if that mindset isn't into the executive?
Well, funny you mention that, because I'm interested in the international research on this subject, and Australians tend to prefer non-risky business. Now, purportedly, Australians take fewer business risks than the U.S. and a lot fewer risk than the British. But Australia is ranked ahead of other conservative nations such as France, Belgium, Japan, Greece. And the interesting thing to me, according to research, is that Australians don't regard failure as a learning experience, which Americans supposedly do. Now, if Australian business is risk adverse, it's probably due to us being a small but very robust economy that gets buffered around significantly by the trade winds which emanate from the US or Europe or China. But, as you know, Australia has had 23 continuous years of economic growth, and that's not an accident. So my point on this is prudent management of risk is the Australian way. And if you're coming to Australia, you need to understand that.
So you said that I don't want to paraphrase you, but we're adverse to risk as opposed to our American cousins.
Well, that's what some research says.
I'm sure that a lot of our listeners may disagree with you on that. We have I believe we have a culture that of a moderated risk, a measured risk.
That's how I would interpret the data.
Yeah.
And another way of looking at it, and I think you just gave a good example when you're working in Texas, is that Australians do whatever works.
Yeah.
There's an emphasis on that. Leadership studies highlight Australians have a readiness to accept something that works. Whereas, as you've highlighted, you've experienced it, I've seen it a zillion times, U.S. leadership requires reassurance that everything is done to specification. Whereas Australian management is much more flexible and practical in style, get it done. And that's why Australians work well within teams, just because they get on with the job.
Do you see, and I just want to take it off on a tangent for a quick moment, with what you've just said, do you see that as being a risk to those American executives when they go back, when their tour of duty is ended and they go back to their structured, make sure that these results are going to happen lifestyle, that they've taken back this mindset of whatever works? Is that a problem?
Probably not, and I'll tell you why. Because when you work in Australia, you learn to be flexible and adaptable. So when you go back to that hierarchical structure, you become flexible and adaptable to that because you learn to be flexible and adaptable in Australia.
Well, yeah, I can see that.
Also, let me say something controversial here. One of the things I see in the U.S. Multinationals is that they're actually afraid. They're afraid of their bosses. They're afraid of the senior executives.
I've seen that.
Yeah, and it's a shame because what it does, it cuts off the senior executives from the valuable input from the ground level. So they don't have the full information with which to make informed decisions because they got so many yes men and yes women and managers saluting them instead of asking them trenchant, penetrating questions about those decisions. And that's a real problem I see in U.S. corporate life.
I couldn't agree more. Duff, we've known each other for a very, very long time. You gave me an anecdote once that, that football tells it all when it comes to business.
Football.
Just share that with our listeners today.
Football explains a lot about life, but dig this. They did this 50-nation study, and Australia was ranked second only to the U.S. as the most individualistic nation. But unlike the U.S., Australian organizations prefer flexibility and autonomy in the workplace. So issuing orders to Australia from an overseas headquarters without local input is just going to get you resistance or rebellion. So I use that sports analogy because if you've ever seen Australian football, it's very fluid. It lacks structured play. Now, there are plans, there is strategy, but the teams rely on the flexibility and the innovation among the individual players to achieve the team goal. Now, you contrast that with gridiron, American football, which I played in university. They use highly structured plays. By the way, each play, there's an identical version on the opponent. They all have the same plays, but just slightly different versions of it. And each play is highly detailed, very explicit, very tailored to each player's designated purpose. So in other words, one is like jazz music and the other is like classical music. One is highly structured, one is less so. Now, both approaches work well but not in both sports. And so when you're in Australia, it's Australian rules, not American gridiron rules.
Very true. If we can just expand on the analogy, if Australian players have never seen these structured plays, they will work at first for a very limited time. Would you agree with that statement?
What do you mean?
So, I've never seen American football before, and
Wait a
you're
minute.
a
You
coach.
lived in Texas?
No. I'm
Oh, okay. You're pretending. Okay.
I've never seen American football before, and you've just come across as an American and coached the opposing Australian team and coached them with American standard plays. Now, I would hazard to guess that at first, for maybe the first minute or so, I would be a little confused about what's happening, and you would have the advantage. So I saw this. The reason I bring this up is because I saw this in my early career with American companies coming to Australia with IT back in the 80s. And Aussie companies couldn't keep up. We didn't know what was happening here. And we would be following the coach from the US telling us, this is the way you're structured, this is how you make a call. This analogy, though, is absolutely accurate today because that information is still the same. The way American businesses operate today is very similar to the way they operated 20, 25 years ago from a structural point of view. And Australian companies have become a lot more flexible. Have you seen that in your career?
Yeah, I think Australian business is a lot more confident, and Australia as a country is a lot more confident, and so they should be. And so they're more likely now than ever to question the coach's input if it simply doesn't make any bloody sense.
Yes. Well, would you say that's because we live in this beautiful country? We have a lot of leisure time that we can just get back to who we are and have a bit of balance?
You hear the phrase life-work balance a lot, but
I try not to use that phrase.
Yeah, I know, but it's a good one because in Australia it's life-work balanced. We've actually done it. See, work's only a part of life in Australia. I don't know if it's still the all-consuming activity that dominates life in the U.S. It seems to be sometimes, but evidently the balance is correct in Australia because Australia is ranked as the happiest country in the world. It's ranked as the richest country in the world if you judge by median income. Australia has the best distribution of wealth among developed nations. So I think Australia tells the world, hey, you keep your work ethic, we'll keep ours. Because I think the results are in.
Yeah, I agree. Having worked in several places, Asia, Europe, America, I totally agree with you. We are in a wonderfully lucky country. And, for our listeners in the US who want to come to Australia, I mean, these are golden tips. If I may add one to it, and that is look Australian, because we want to. It's not that we're xenophobic, but we basically it's a piece of advice that works in any market. Look local. So here in Australia, you mentioned before, Duff, that in America the title is important. In Australia, it's not. I would like to think that Aussies are egalitarian in the way we approach ourselves, our lives, and our business.
They are. They really are. I mean, this is what I like to tell people. In Australia, we're all equal here. I mean, really. I'm not just saying it, it's the truth. Australian business is much less hierarchical than other countries. Senior executives are much more open and accessible than in other societies. I can give you two examples. Okay, a couple weeks ago, I'm walking down the street here in Sydney, and then I pass John Howard. Now, John Howard is Australia's second longest serving Prime Minister. And he was walking by himself, he was unattended, he was alone, he was just another citizen on a stroll. And nobody cared. And that's a great way to be. Now, here's another. Several years ago, I'm in a restaurant, and Australia's third longest serving Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, comes in with his wife. He sits down at the booth next to me, where I'm with my friends. Nobody stares. Nobody comments. Nobody did anything, except the young waiter who went over to him and said, "Hi, Bob," the usual, which, by the way, was mineral water because he's a reformed alcoholic. And so, again, he's a regular there. So my point is this: we really are equal in Australia, and that's how we like it. And that's one of the great secrets of the Australian way of life.
Oh, look, it absolutely is. But let me bring it back to the business focus. What does that mean? What does that mean? So what if we're egalitarian? So what if we're equal?
It means you don't waste a lot of psychological, emotional energy on being defensive about titles and territory and ego. It means you capture the synergy that is there to be captured by the workers and the management within your business.
But so in a business culture context, and I want to make this point very, very clear, and that's why I'm pushing this with you. In a business cultural context, it doesn't mean that I, as a CEO of an organization, will be pally and very familiar with my staff, does it?
No. But what it means is you're approachable and accessible.
And there is the difference. The respect factor still is there for the position, not for the person. I mean, well, I should say the person was always being respected, but you've got to respect the fact that a CEO is the CEO of the organization you work for.
Okay, here's a statistic that comes to mind now that you mention it, Rob. 40% of an employee's effort is discretionary. In other words, I come in, I work for you, I punch in at 9 o'clock, I leave at 5 o'clock, that's my 60%. The other 40%, going the extra mile, doing the extra thing, that's entirely at my discretion.
Yep.
And you have to educe, you have to inspire me to give that to you and to the company.
And you, in your opinion, think that we inspire Aussies, Australian companies, inspire that or are better at inspiring that than our American cultural cousins?
Yes.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Look, Duff, this has been absolutely insightful, but let me ask you finally, just to leave us with, I suppose, the lesson that you think that we need to know.
It took me 35 years to gather the information that we've been discussing, Rob, but here's some good news for listeners out there. If you're overseas, you can borrow some fluency. You don't really need to understand the intricacies of Australian culture when you're doing business in Australia. But somebody does. Australians and Americans or non-Americans speak English, just like that old George Bernard Shaw joke, Australia and the U.S. are two people separated by a common language. So you don't need to be fluent in the Australian way of doing things, but somebody does. So if you're not fluent, you can borrow hours. And when I mean hours, here's a commercial for the American Chamber of Commerce. There is a repository of knowledge, cross-cultural knowledge within the American Chamber of Commerce that many employers could gain access to, probably at no charge. And certainly AmCham is always happy to speak to you. Certainly my firm, ExecSearch International, is happy to talk to you about executive search, executive development. And there's no charge for that. So I'm just waving the flag for AmCham here because that's where you can find a great repository of knowledge.
Well, thank you, Duff. I appreciate your time. My name is Robert Hossery. You've been listening to Dr. Duff Watkins here on our AmCham podcast, telling you about the right ways to do business in Australia. Duff, we really do appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much, and we hope to hear you at the next AmCham Business Podcast. AmCham, bringing business to you.
You've been listening to the business podcast of the American Chamber of Commerce in Australia. This podcast is supported by Lenovo and VML. Lenovo is one of the world's leading personal technology companies producing innovative PCs and mobile internet devices. Lenovo, for those who do. VML is a full-service digital marketing agency that can take you where you want to go. Everything we are is in everything we do. This is AmCham.